Miss Marple and the Secret of the Blue Room. Welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm Allie, your host, and I'm so glad you're here for another Miss Marple mystery. It's always heartwarming how these stories bring us together from different parts of the world. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I truly enjoy reading every single one. Don't forget to subscribe as we share new mysteries every day. Now, pour yourself a cup of tea or coffee, get cozy, and let's uncover tonight's secret. Chapter 1. A Guest for the Blue Room. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Gossington Hall, casting golden patches across the Persian carpet in Mrs. Bantry's morning room. Dolly Bantry stood before her escritoire, pen poised over a sheet of cream notepaper, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Arthur," she called to her husband, who sat behind the Times in his favorite armchair, "do you think we should mention the Tudor chest in the drawing room for the hospital fund afternoon, or would that seem rather presumptuous?" Colonel Bantry lowered his newspaper with the resigned air of a man who knew that domestic tranquility depended upon appearing to consider such weighty matters. "My dear, I'm sure whatever you decide will be perfectly suitable, though I dare say people come more for your excellent tea than to gawk at our furniture." Mrs. Bantry smiled fondly at him. The Hospital Fund Antiques afternoon had been her idea, inspired by a similar event at the vicarage the previous spring. Local worthies would pay half a crown each to wander about examining treasures, real or imagined, while consuming quantities of sandwiches and cake. The proceeds would benefit the cottage hospital, a cause dear to her heart since her nephew's bout with pneumonia the winter before. "I do hope Mr. Mann proves helpful," she mused, returning to her correspondence. "Mrs. Clement speaks so highly of his expertise." Basil Mand was a rare book scout who had recently taken lodgings in the village, a suave gentleman of perhaps 45, with prematurely silver hair and an air of cosmopolitan sophistication that seemed rather exotic in sleepy St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Clement had encountered him examining the parish records and been charmed by his knowledge of local history. When Dolly mentioned the trunk of old pamphlets discovered in Gossington's attic, Mrs. Clement had immediately suggested consulting Mr. Mand. The doorbell chimed, and presently James appeared in his stately butler's manner. "Mr. Simmons to see you, madam." The family solicitor entered, briefcase in hand, his usually cheerful countenance bearing traces of concern. "Good morning, Dolly." "Colonel, I hope I'm not intruding, but there's a small matter I thought you should know about before this afternoon's gathering." Mrs. Bantry gestured him to a chair. "Nothing serious, I hope." "Oh no, nothing alarming. It's simply that I've had an inquiry about the Gossington property records. A gentleman named Mand came to my office yesterday asking about historical documents related to the estate. Perfectly legitimate, of course, but he seemed particularly interested in any family papers or correspondence that might bear upon property boundaries." Colonel Bantry's eyebrows rose. "Property boundaries? Good heavens! We're not about to discover we've been living on someone else's land for 30 years, are we?" Mr. Simmons chuckled. "Nothing so dramatic. Mr. Mann mentioned he'd found something interesting in his research, but he was rather mysterious about it. Said it might affect certain property settlements, though he wouldn't elaborate. I thought you should be aware in case he raises the subject this afternoon." The morning passed quickly with final preparations. Mrs. Beddoes, the housekeeper, supervised the arrangement of flowers and the polishing of silver, while James ensured the best china was properly displayed. Mabel Finch arrived from the village, with printed programs for the event, her stationer's precision evident in the neat typography. By 2 Gossington Hall buzzed with genteel activity. The Reverend and Mrs. Clement admired the morning room's watercolors while Dr. Haydock examined the carriage clock with professional interest. Inspector Slack, off-duty but curious, lingered near the display of military memorabilia in the library. Basil Mand arrived fashionably late, accompanied by a sharp-eyed gentleman in expensive clothes, whom he introduced as Lionel Swyn, a London dealer. Swyn's eyes swept the rooms with calculating appraisal, though he was polite enough in his manner. "Mrs. Bantry," he said, taking her hand with practiced charm, "how delightful to see Gossington in all its glory. I do hope you've saved the most intriguing pieces for last." "I'm afraid we're rather modest collectors," Dolly replied, "though I understand you found something interesting in our dusty old pamphlets." Mand's smile became slightly enigmatic. "Indeed. In fact, I wonder if I might impose upon your hospitality and spend the night. I should very much like to examine the documents more thoroughly, and the Blue Room has such excellent morning light for detailed work." Mrs. Bantry felt a small flutter of unease, though she could not have said why. The Blue Room was their finest guest chamber, furnished with family pieces, and commanding a view of the rose garden. It had not been occupied since her sister's visit at Christmas. "Of course you're most welcome," she said, "though I should warn you it's rather isolated at the end of the corridor." "Perfect," Mand replied. "I work best without distractions." As the afternoon progressed, she noticed Mand and Swyn in intense, low-voiced conversation by the library window. Swyn's expression grew increasingly agitated, while Mand maintained his calm composure. When she approached with offers of tea, their conversation ceased abruptly. "Mr. Swyn was just admiring your portrait in the front hall," Mand said smoothly. "I told him it was a particularly fine example of the period." The guests began departing as evening approached, but Mand remained, claiming he wished to begin his examination of the papers immediately. At 6, Mrs. Bantry found herself telephoning Jane Marple. "My dear Jane, I know this is terribly short notice, but would you consider staying the night? I find myself rather nervous about having a stranger in the house, particularly one who seems so interested in our family affairs." Miss Marple's gentle voice carried clearly through the receiver. "Of course, Dolly. I was just thinking how pleasant it would be to see Gossington again. Shall I come for dinner?" Relief flooded through Mrs. Bantry. "Bless you, Jane. James will collect you at 7. As she replaced the receiver, she caught sight of Mon through the drawing-room window, walking purposefully across the lawn toward the village, his figure quickly disappearing into the gathering dusk. When he returned an hour later, his shoes bore traces of mud, though the rain had not yet begun. At dinner, Mand proved an entertaining companion, regaling them with anecdotes of his travels and discoveries. Yet, Mrs. Bantry noticed he deflected questions about his current research with practiced ease. "I prefer not to discuss my findings until I'm quite certain of their significance," he said when pressed. "One doesn't wish to raise false hopes or indeed unnecessary concerns." After dinner, as they moved to the drawing-room for coffee, Mand excused himself. "If you don't mind, I'll retire early. I'm particularly eager to examine that bundle of correspondence you mentioned, Mrs. Bantry. Something tells me tomorrow may prove most illuminating." As his footsteps faded up the main staircase, Miss Marple observed quietly, "An interesting gentleman, though perhaps one who enjoys the dramatic possibilities of mystery rather more than its resolution." Mrs. Bantry nodded, unable to shake her growing sense of unease. Outside, the first drops of rain began to patter against the windows, and somewhere in the depths of the old house, a door closed with a definitive click. Chapter 2. Bell at 9:40. Rain that had begun as gentle pattering during dinner had steadily intensified throughout the evening, drumming against the windows of Gossington Hall with increasing persistence. In the drawing room, Colonel Bantry dozed peacefully in his chair while Mrs. Bantry worked at her embroidery, the clicking of her needle keeping time with the raindrops. Miss Marple sat nearby, her knitting needles moving with their customary rhythm, though her sharp blue eyes occasionally lifted to observe the room's occupants. "I do hope Mr. Mand has everything he needs," Mrs. Bantry murmured, glancing toward the ceiling as if she could see through to the blue room above. "The windows in that room can be rather drafty when the wind is from the east. I'm sure he's quite comfortable," Miss Marple replied gently. "He struck me as a gentleman well accustomed to making himself at home in unfamiliar surroundings." At 9:30, Lionel Swyn appeared in the doorway, impeccably dressed despite the lateness of the hour. His earlier agitation seemed to have been replaced by a curious restlessness that manifested in frequent glances at his pocket watch. "Mrs. Bantry, I do apologize for the intrusion, but I'm afraid I must catch the early train to London tomorrow. A business matter has arisen that requires my immediate attention." His smile was apologetic but strained. "I was hoping I might have one last look at that magnificent portrait in the front hall. The lighting this afternoon didn't quite do it justice." Mrs. Bantry set down her embroidery with a gracious smile. "Of course, Mr. Swyn, though I must say you flatter us terribly. It's merely a family piece, nothing of great artistic merit." "Nevertheless, I should be most grateful." As they made their way toward the front hall, Miss Marple noted the time on the mantelpiece clock. 9:35. The grandfather clock in the corridor chimed the half-hour as they passed, its deep resonance echoing through the house. In the servants' hall below stairs, James sat at the long oak table, methodically cleaning the silver, while keeping one eye on the indicator board that showed which rooms had rung for service. Mrs. Beddoes bustled about, supervising the final clearing of the dinner service and ensuring all was in order for the night. At precisely 9:40, a sharp ping echoed through the servants' hall. James looked up immediately, his trained eye finding the source on the indicator board. "Blue room," he announced to Mrs. Beddoes, rising from his chair to check the notation. The brass disc beside the room designation had dropped into the called position, and the thin black line on the board pointed unmistakably to the guest chamber at the end of the east corridor. "That will be Mr. Mand wanting his nightcap, I expect," Mrs. Beddoes said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Or perhaps the fire's died down. That room can be chilly on a night like this." James carefully noted the time in the service log. "Blue, room 9:40 p.m., in his precise handwriting. It was a habit of long standing, one that had served the household well in keeping track of guests' requirements and ensuring prompt attention to their needs. Upstairs, Mrs. Bantry and Lionel Swyn stood, before the portrait that had hung in the front hall for 3 generations. The painting depicted her husband's great-grandfather in his regimental uniform, a stern-faced gentleman with penetrating eyes that seemed to follow the observer about the room. "Remarkable brushwork," Swyn murmured, though his attention seemed divided. "The artist has captured something quite compelling in the subject's expression. One feels he might step from the frame at any moment." Mrs. Bantry found herself studying the painting with renewed interest, though she had passed it countless times without particular notice. "My husband's family has always been rather proud of it, though I confess I sometimes find those eyes rather unsettling, particularly in the evening light." They remained before the portrait until nearly 10 minutes to 10, Swyn making observations about technique and composition, while Mrs. Bantry responded with the polite attention of a hostess. When they finally returned to the drawing room, the clock showed 5 minutes before the hour. "Most illuminating," Swyn said, taking his leave. I do hope we shall meet again under more leisurely circumstances. Please give my regards to Mr. Mand and thank him again for his insights this afternoon. Colonel Bantry roused himself from his doze as Swin departed. Fellow seemed rather keen on that old portrait, he observed. Can't think why. Great-grandfather always looked like he'd eaten something disagreeable, if you ask me. Arthur, really? Mrs. Bantry chided, though she smiled as she said it. It was 10 minutes past 10 when James ascended to the blue room, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of the east corridor. He carried a small tray with brandy and soda, thinking the gentleman might appreciate something warming on such a wet night. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly before him, lit at intervals by wall sconces that cast dancing shadows on the oak paneling. When he reached the blue room door, James knocked respectfully and waited. No response came from within. He knocked again, more firmly this time, and called softly, "Mr. Mand, sir, I've brought you a nightcap." Still nothing. James tried the door handle and found it locked. This was not unusual in itself. Many guests preferred to secure their rooms for the night, but the complete absence of any sound from within began to trouble him. He pressed his ear to the door and heard only the rain against the windows and the settling creaks of the old house. Concerned now, James hurried back downstairs to report to Colonel Bantry. Within minutes, the colonel had joined him in the corridor, followed by Mrs. Bantry and Miss Marple. Dr. Haydock, who had been invited to stay for a game of bridge that had never materialized due to the evening's disruptions, accompanied them, with his medical bag. "Mr. Mand?" Colonel Bantry called through the door, his military voice carrying clearly. "Are you quite all right, sir?" The silence that followed seemed to pulse with foreboding. Colonel Bantry turned to James with a grave expression. "Fetch Inspector Slack from the village at once." Inspector Slack arrived within 20 minutes, his raincoat streaming water and his expression grimly professional. He had been summoned from his comfortable evening by the fire, and his mood reflected his displeasure at the interruption. "Now then," he said briskly, examining the door. "Keys turned on the inside. I can see that much. Are we certain the gentleman isn't simply a heavy sleeper?" James heard the bell ring at 9:40, Mrs. Bantry explained. Surely if Mr. Mand were well, he would have answered by now. Inspector Slack nodded curtly. "Right then, stand back, please." The lock proved stubborn, but between the inspector and Colonel Bantry, the door finally yielded. It swung open to reveal a scene that would be etched in their memories for years to come. Basil Mand sat slumped in the comfortable armchair beside the tea table, his silver head tilted at an unnatural angle. His face bore a waxy pallor that spoke of death, and his lips held a faint blue tinge. On the table beside him sat a half-empty bottle bearing a chemist label, and nearby a teacup rested. In its saucer, the liquid within, long since cold. The windows were securely latched from the inside, the curtains drawn against the night. The key to the room lay on the carpet near Mand's feet, as if it had dropped from nerveless fingers. The bolt on the door had been shot home from within. Dr. Haydock moved immediately to examine the body, his professional manner a comfort in the face of the shocking scene. After several minutes, he straightened and shook his head gravely. "He's been dead for some time. An hour at least, possibly longer. The symptoms suggest heart failure, though I'll need to examine him more thoroughly to be certain." Inspector Slack surveyed the room with methodical attention. Locked from the inside, window secured, key dropped inside. Looks straightforward. Enough, I'm afraid. Poor fellow must have taken a bad turn and tried to dose himself from that bottle there. Miss Marple, who had remained quietly in the doorway, spoke for the first time since entering the corridor. Inspector, might I ask about the bell that rang at 9:40? James was most precise about the time. Slack glanced at the bell pull cord hanging beside the fireplace. It appeared undisturbed, its brass handle gleaming dully in the lamplight. On the wall, the indicator board still showed the blue room designation. Simple enough, Slack replied. Gentleman felt poorly, rang for assistance, but was overcome before help could arrive. Unfortunate, but hardly mysterious. Yet as Miss Marple's keen eyes took in the details of the room, she noticed several small things that troubled her quiet. Mind the muddy but dry condition of man's shoes, the slightly askew position of the tea tray on its table, and most particularly the faint green smear on the saucer beneath the teacup that bore no resemblance to tea stains. The blue room held its secrets close, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that the smallest details often revealed the greatest truths. Chapter 3. Locked from Within, Doctor. Haydock knelt beside Basil Mann's still form, his experienced hands conducting their silent examination with practiced efficiency. The blue room, which had seemed so welcoming in the afternoon light, now felt oppressive despite its elegant furnishings and cheerful chintz curtains. The rain continued its steady assault against the windows, providing a melancholy accompaniment to the grim proceedings. No signs of violence whatsoever, the doctor murmured, more to himself than to the assembled group. The pulse would have been irregular, judging by the condition of the fingernails. Classic signs of digitalis poisoning, I'd venture, though. I'll need to conduct a more thorough examination to be certain. Inspector Slack moved about the room with the methodical precision of a man accustomed to such scenes, though his manner suggested he considered the matter already resolved. Heart drops, you say? That would explain the bottle. He gestured toward the small brown vessel on the tea table, its cork stopper sitting beside it. Poor fellow must have overdosed himself in his distress. Miss Marple remained near the doorway, her knitting bag clutched in her hands, though her sharp eyes missed nothing. She observed the way the key lay precisely where it had fallen, the undisturbed condition of the bedclothes, and most particularly the neat arrangement of the bell pull, cord hanging beside the fireplace. The key was definitely inside when we forced the door, Colonel Bantry confirmed, his military bearing somewhat shaken by the evening's events. I saw it fall myself when Slack turned the handle. And the bolt was shot home from within, James added quietly. I tried the door myself not 20 minutes after hearing the bell. Sir, it was secure. Then Dr. Haydock rose from his examination, brushing dust from his trousers. The symptoms are consistent with digitalis toxicity: nausea, irregular heartbeat, eventual cardiac arrest. If he took too much of his medicine in a moment of panic, he shrugged expressively. Inspector Slack picked up the brown bottle and examined its label. Sal volatile, he read aloud. Prescribed by Dr. Morrison of Harley Street. Dates recent enough. He removed the cork and sniffed cautiously. Smells about right, though. He frowned and sniffed again. Something not quite usual about it. Mrs. Bantry pressed her handkerchief to her nose. Oh, that dreadful smell. Surely sal volatile doesn't normally have such a bitter quality to it. Each chemist mixes them slightly differently, Dr. Haydock replied, though his tone suggested some uncertainty. Some add herbs or other compounds to make the medicine more palatable. Miss Marple stepped carefully into the room, her eyes drawn to the indicator board on the wall. The brass disc still showed the blue room designation, and beneath it, the time notation read clearly. Last call 9:40. Inspector, she said gently, might I ask about this indicator? James mentioned he hearing the bell at 9:40 precisely. Slack glanced at the mechanism with perfunctory interest. Simple enough. The gentleman felt poorly, rang for help, but was overcome before assistance arrived. The bell system shows exactly what we'd expect. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, then moved toward the tea table. The tray sat slightly askew, as if it had been nudged sideways after being properly arranged. The cup and saucer bore the remnants of what appeared to be tea, though the liquid had long since grown cold. But it was the saucer that particularly caught her attention. "How curious," she murmured, bending slightly to examine it more closely. "There appears to be a faint green smear here, just beneath where the cup was sitting. Rather an unusual color for tea stains, wouldn't you say?" Dr. Haydock joined her at the table. "Green, you say?" He adjusted his spectacles and peered at the porcelain. "You're quite right. That's not from tea at all. More like, well, it's hard to say without proper analysis." The housemaid mentioned that Mr. Mand was particular about his tea, Mrs. Bantry offered. Perhaps he added something to it, some sort of herbal remedy. Mrs. Beddoes would know. James suggested she supervise the preparation of both trays that went up this evening. Miss Marple's attention had been caught by something else entirely. She was examining Mand's shoes, which were visible beneath the hem of his trousers as he sat slumped in the chair. "Most interesting," she observed quietly. "His shoes are quite muddy, but the mud appears to be completely dry. Yet he returned from the village less than 2 hours ago, and it's been raining steadily since before dinner." Colonel Bantry frowned. "What are you suggesting, Jane?" "Oh, nothing definite," Miss Marple replied with her customary diffidence. "It's simply that one would expect some dampness if he had walked through the rain so recently. But perhaps he remained in the village longer than we thought, and the mud dried completely before the rain began in earnest." Inspector Slack was growing impatient with what he clearly considered unnecessary complications. "The facts are plain enough. Locked room, key inside, medicine bottle at hand, no signs of violence. The gentleman took ill and attempted to treat himself. Unfortunately, he took too much and paid the price. Tragic, but hardly mysterious." "Of course, Inspector," Marple agreed mildly. "I'm sure you're quite right, though I do find myself wondering about the timing. If Mr. Mand rang the bell at 9:40, as the indicator clearly shows, then he was alive at that time. Yet Dr. Haydock suggests he has been dead for at least an hour." Dr. Haydock looked troubled. "Well, yes, that is somewhat puzzling. Death is not always easy to time precisely, of course, but the condition of the body does suggest—" He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with the discrepancy. "Perhaps the indicator board is unreliable," Mrs. Bantry suggested hopefully. James looked genuinely affronted. "Begging your pardon, madam, but the bell system was overhauled completely just 2 years ago. It's as reliable as the day it was installed. When that bell rang at 9:40, someone in this room pulled that cord." Miss Marple moved to examine the bell pull more closely. The cord hung neatly beside the fireplace, its brass handle polished to a dull gleam. She followed its path upward with her eyes, noting how it disappeared behind the tall mahogany wardrobe that stood against the far wall. "Such ingenious systems," she commented. "I remember my dear father explaining how they worked when I was a child. The cord connects to a wire that runs through the walls to the servants' hall below. Quite a marvel of engineering for its time. Gossington has one of the finest in the county," Colonel Bantry said with evident pride. "My grandfather spared no expense when he had it installed. Mrs. Beddoes always says she's never known it to fail." Miss Marple nodded approvingly, though her eyes continued to study the arrangement with obvious interest. "I don't suppose anyone has examined the system recently. Sometimes these old mechanisms can develop peculiar habits of their own." Inspector Slack sighed heavily. "Miss Marple, with all due respect, I think we're overcomplicating a straightforward matter. The gentleman is dead. The room was locked from inside, and there's a medicine bottle that explains everything. Unless you're suggesting someone murdered him and then vanished into thin air, I see no reason to pursue wild theories about faulty bell systems. Oh no, Inspector, Miss Marple replied with gentle firmness. I would never suggest anything so dramatic. I simply believe that in matters such as these, it's important to understand exactly what happened, even if it confirms what we already suspect. Small details often prove most illuminating, don't you find? As if to emphasize her point, a gust of wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the depths of the old house, a door creaked on its hinges. The blue room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the truth to emerge from the shadows. Chapter 4. 2 trays the following morning brought a gray, drizzling dawn that seemed to reflect the somber mood that had settled over Gossington Hall. Inspector Slack had remained through the night, conducting what he termed routine inquiries, though his manner suggested his conclusions were already firmly established. Dr. Haydock had departed to make arrangements for a more thorough examination of the deceased, promising to return by midday with his findings. Miss Marple found Mrs. Beddoes in the housekeeper's room, a comfortable chamber lined with ledgers and hung with keys that jingled softly whenever their owner moved. The older woman sat at her desk, her usually composed features bearing traces of the night's distress. Such a terrible thing, Mrs. Beddoes murmured, dabbing at her eyes with a practical cotton handkerchief. In all my years at Gossington, nothing like this has ever happened. Poor Mr. Mand seemed such a pleasant gentleman. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed, settling herself in the chair opposite. I wonder if you might help me understand the evening's arrangements. Inspector Slack mentioned that 2 trays went up to the blue room. Mrs. Beddoes nodded, consulting a small notebook she kept for household records. Yes, that's quite right. I supervised both myself, as I always do, for important guests. The first went up at 8:45 with Elsie, our housemaid. Tea service, proper china, and some of Cook's seed cake. Mr. Mand had particularly requested tea rather than coffee. And the second tray, that was James, who took it up at 9:15. Mr. Mand had sent down a specific request for sal volatile, said he was feeling rather poorly and needed his tonic. James carried up the bottle from the medicine cabinet in the pantry along with a glass of water. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked thoughtfully. How did Mr. Mand seem when Elsie took up the tea? According to Elsie, he was snappy but quite alive. She said he barely looked up from his papers when she entered, just waved her toward the table and muttered something about not being disturbed. She thought him rather rude, though she didn't say so in so many words. And when James arrived with the medicine, Mrs. Beddoes consulted her notes again. James said the door was bolted when he reached it at 9:15. He had to knock several times before Mr. Mand called out to leave the bottle by the door. Most unusual, really. James offered to bring it in properly, but Mr. Mand insisted he was not to be disturbed. This information troubles Miss Marple considerably. So James left the bottle outside the door? That's right. He waited a moment to see if Mr. Mand might change his mind, then placed the bottle and glass on the floor and returned downstairs. He noted it in the service log as unusual, which is how I remember it so clearly. Yet the bottle was found inside the room on the tea table. Mrs. Beddoes looked puzzled. Why, yes, it was. Mr. Mand must have retrieved it after James left. Miss Marple considered this carefully. If Mand had been alive and able to retrieve the bottle at 9:15 and had rung the bell at 9:40, then Dr. Haydock's estimate of the time of death seemed increasingly problematic. Mrs. Beddoes, might I examine the bottle that was sent up? Or was there perhaps another bottle of sal volatile in the house? There was only the one bottle in the medicine cabinet. Dr. Morrison prescribed it for Mr. Mann just last week, according to the label. James brought it up exactly as it was. And you're certain about the timing of the bell? 9:40 precisely? Mrs. Beddoes's expression grew slightly defensive. Miss Marple, I've been managing this household for 15 years. James noted the time in the service log the moment the bell rang, as is proper procedure. 9:40 exactly, no question about it. At that moment, James himself appeared in the doorway, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of the previous night's strain. Begging your pardon, Mrs. Beddoes, but Inspector Slack wishes to speak with you about the telephone calls. Telephone. Calls? Miss Marple inquired gently. James turned to address her. The exchange operator mentioned that there was a call from Gossington at 9:05 last night. Someone upstairs requested connection to a London number. Inspector Slack is trying to determine who placed the call. Mrs. Beddoes frowned. I wasn't aware of any telephone calls. The upstairs extension is in the Blue Room's anteroom, isn't it? That old servant's line that connects to the main system. That's right, ma'am. It was installed years ago, so guests could call for service without using the bell system, though most prefer the traditional method. Miss Marple found this development particularly intriguing. James, when you took up the medicine bottle at 9:15, did you notice whether the anteroom door was open or closed? Closed, miss. Though I did hear what sounded like papers rustling inside the Blue Room, so Mr. Mand was certainly active at that time. And the telephone call was placed at 9:05. According to the operator, yes, she remembered it particularly because the caller asked for a London number, but then disconnected before the connection was completed. She said it was a gentleman's voice, very agitated. The pieces of the puzzle seemed to shift and reform in Miss Marple's mind. A telephone call at 9:05, James's delivery of medicine at 9:15 to a bolted door, and the bell ringing at 9:40 with its claim of life. Yet Dr. Haydock insisted the man had been dead for over an hour when they found him at 10:15. Mrs. Beddoes, she said carefully, might I ask about the sal volatile itself? You mentioned examining the bottle. Well, naturally, I checked it before James took it up. One must be careful with medicines. The label was proper, from Morrison's Pharmacy in Harley Street, and the cork seemed tight, though I must say... She paused, looking troubled. Yes? The smell wasn't quite what I expected. Sal volatile usually has that sharp, clean scent, rather like smelling salts. This had something else to it, something almost bitter. I assumed perhaps Dr. Morrison had added herbs or other compounds to make it more effective. Miss Marple's needles clicked more rapidly. Did you mention this to James? Don't believe so. It didn't seem important at the time. Inspector Slack's heavy footsteps could be heard approaching down the corridor, accompanied by voices engaged in what sounded like heated discussion. Miss Marple rose from her chair, her mind already working through the implications of what she had learned. Mrs. Beddoes, one final question, if you don't mind. The Blue Room's anteroom, where the telephone extension is located, is it accessible from the main room? Oh, yes. There's a connecting door. It's where we store extra linens and supplies for that wing of the house. Quite convenient, really, though it hasn't been used much since before the war. And the key to this anteroom? Mrs. Beddoes touched the ring of keys at her waist unconsciously. I keep all the household keys naturally, though I believe there may be duplicates somewhere. Old houses like Gossington tend to accumulate extra keys over the years. Inspector Slack appeared in the doorway, his expression suggesting frustration with the morning's developments. Mrs. Beddoes, I need to speak. with you about that telephone call. The operator is quite certain it came from the Blue Room extension." As the housekeeper rose to accompany the inspector, Miss Marple reflected on the growing complexity of what had initially appeared to be a straightforward tragedy. 2 trays, a bolted door, a mysterious telephone call, and a medicine bottle with an unusual smell. Each detail seemed to deepen rather than resolve the mystery of what had occurred in the Blue Room during those crucial minutes between 9 and 10 Mire on the previous evening. Chapter 5. Wire over the wardrobe, the Blue Room appeared. Even more melancholy in the gray morning light that filtered through its tall windows. Inspector Slack had finished his preliminary examination of the scene and departed for the village, leaving strict instructions that nothing was to be disturbed. However, Miss Marple found herself drawn back to the chamber, ostensibly to retrieve a book she claimed to have left there the previous evening. Mrs. Bantry accompanied her, both women moving with the hushed reverence that death seemed to demand. The tea tray had been removed, and the chair where Basil Mand had spent his final moments sat empty, though neither woman could bring herself to look at it directly. "I still cannot quite believe it," Mrs. Bantry murmured, adjusting the curtains to admit more light. "He seemed so vital, so full of plans and mysterious discoveries. And now—" Miss Marple nodded sympathetically while her keen eyes surveyed the room with renewed attention. Something had been troubling her throughout the sleepless night, a nagging sense that the scene before them was not quite what it appeared to be. She moved toward the bell pull beside the fireplace, her gaze following the braided cord upward to where it disappeared behind the imposing mahogany wardrobe. "Such elaborate systems they had in the old days," she observed, approaching the wardrobe. "I confess, I've always been curious about how these bell mechanisms actually function." The wardrobe was a magnificent piece, easily 7 feet tall and built of solid mahogany that had deepened to a rich chocolate brown with age. It stood against the wall with perhaps 6 inches of clearance, just enough space for the bell wire to pass behind it on its journey to the servants' hall below. Miss Marple moved to examine the gap between the wardrobe and the wall, tilting her head, to peer into the shadowy recess. What she saw there made her catch her breath sharply. "Dolly, might I trouble you to help me move this wardrobe just slightly? I believe there's something caught behind it." Mrs. Bantry looked puzzled but obliging. "Of course, though it looks terribly heavy. Are you quite sure?" To their surprise, the wardrobe moved with unexpected ease, rolling smoothly on hidden casters that had been invisible from the front. As it shifted away from the wall, Miss Marple's sharp eyes immediately spotted what had caught her attention. A wire running horizontally across a small pulley mechanism, and wedged where the wire met the wheel were 2 small objects that had no business being there. "How very curious," Miss Marple murmured, reaching carefully to extract the items. The first was an ordinary hairpin bent into a specific shape. The second was a thin sliver of tin cut from what appeared to be a larger piece of metal. Mrs. Bantry peered over her shoulder. "Whatever are those doing there?" Miss Marple examined the objects carefully, then looked up at the pulley system with growing comprehension. "I believe, my dear, that someone has been rather ingenious. Watch what happens when I wedge these back into place." She carefully repositioned the hairpin and tin sliver exactly where she had found them, creating a deliberate impediment where the wire met the pulley wheel. Then, returning to the main room, she gave the tea table a gentle nudge, causing it to shift slightly on the carpet. The vibration traveled through the floor, causing the wardrobe to shiver almost imperceptibly. This tiny movement was enough to shift the wedged wire against the pulley, and immediately a clear ping echoed from somewhere within the walls, the unmistakable sound of the Blue Room bell. Mrs. Bantry gasped. But no one pulled the bell cord. Precisely, Miss Marple replied, her voice carrying a note of grim satisfaction. Someone arranged for this bell to ring at a predetermined time, creating the impression that Mr. Mand was alive when he most certainly was not. She moved to test her theory further, this time opening one of the tall windows slightly. The resulting shift in air pressure caused the heavy curtains to flutter, and again the wardrobe trembled just enough to trigger the mechanism. Another ping sounded, though fainter this time. But how did they know exactly when it would ring? Mrs. Bantry asked, clearly struggling to comprehend the implications. Miss Marple examined the arrangement more closely. I suspect it was a matter of timing and patience. Someone who knew this room well would understand that small disturbances, a tray being moved, a window opening, even heavy footsteps in the corridor, could trigger the mechanism. At 9:40, something caused the final vibration that sent the signal to the servants' hall. She rolled the wardrobe back to its original position, noting how smoothly it moved on its concealed casters. The wardrobe itself is mounted on wheels, making it simple to shift it just enough to hide or reveal the wire mechanism. Someone familiar with this room's peculiarities would know exactly how to exploit them. Mrs. Bantry sank into a chair, her face pale. You're saying someone murdered Mr. Mand and then arranged for the bell to ring later to establish a false time of death? It would certainly explain the discrepancy between Dr. Haydock's estimate and the bell's timing, Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. If Mr. Mand died sometime before 9:40, the murderer needed to create evidence that he was still alive at that time. The implications of this discovery were staggering. It meant that someone had planned Mand's death with considerable forethought and intimate knowledge of Gossington's domestic arrangements. More troubling still, it suggested that the killer had remained in the house throughout the evening, calmly participating in the discovery of the body, while knowing full well what had actually occurred. Miss Marple moved to examine the window latches, testing each one methodically. All were secure from the inside, showing no signs of tampering. The door remained the only apparent means of entry, yet it had been locked and bolted from within when they found it. There's something else, she murmured, running her hands along the walls near the wardrobe. This mechanism required someone to set it up, someone who had access to this room and knew exactly how the bell system functioned. They would also need time to position everything precisely. Mrs. Bantry watched her friend's methodical examination with growing unease. Jane, what are you looking for now? Another way in, Miss Marple replied simply. Because if someone set this mechanism and then murdered Mr. Mand, they had to have some means of leaving the room while ensuring it remained locked from the inside. The windows are impossible. The main door was securely bolted, so there must be... Her voice trailed off as her fingers detected a slight irregularity in the wall panel near the wardrobe's original position. The wood seemed to give slightly under pressure, suggesting it was not as solid as it appeared. Dolly, she said quietly, I believe we may have found something far more significant than a faulty bell system. This room appears to have secrets that go back much further than last evening's tragedy. The discovery of the rigged bell mechanism had transformed what Inspector Slack considered a straightforward case of accidental overdose into something far more sinister. Someone had deliberately created a false timeline, which meant Basil Mand's death was not the result of a medical mishap, but of calculated murder. The question now was not how he had died, but who among the household had possessed both the knowledge and the opportunity to orchestrate such an elaborate deception. Chapter 6. The linen press door misses. Bantry's hands trembled slightly as she led Miss Marple through the maze of corridors that connected Gossington's various wings. The discovery of the rigged bell mechanism had shaken her profoundly, transforming her comfortable home into a place of hidden dangers and calculated deceptions. "I keep thinking there must be some mistake," she said as they walked. "Surely no one we know could have planned something so elaborate, so coldly deliberate." Miss Marple's expression remained thoughtful but resolute. "I'm afraid, my dear, that the most shocking crimes are often committed by the most ordinary people. Now, you mentioned that your grandmother's linen press backs onto the blue room." "Yes, though I haven't thought about it in years. Grandmother was most particular about the household arrangements, and she had that press built into the wall to make the most efficient use of space. It's just here around this corner." They paused before an imposing piece of built-in furniture that occupied most of one wall in a small anteroom. The linen press was clearly of considerable age, its dark oak panels bearing the patina of decades of careful polishing. Mrs. Bantry produced a key from her household ring and unlocked the double doors, revealing neatly arranged shelves lined with crisp white sheets, pillowcases, and towels. "It's quite deep," Mrs. Bantry explained, stepping aside to allow Miss Marple a better view. "Grandmother insisted it should hold enough linens for a month of house parties." Miss Marple moved closer, her trained eye examining the interior with characteristic thoroughness. The press extended back nearly 4 ft with shelves on both sides, creating a narrow aisle down the center. But it was not the impressive storage capacity that captured her attention. It was the distinct draft she felt emanating from the back wall. "How curious," she murmured, stepping carefully between the shelves. "There seems to be air movement from somewhere." She ran her hands along the back panel, pressing gently at various points. The wood felt solid enough, but the draft persisted, suggesting an opening somewhere behind the apparent wall. Her fingers traced the vertical joins between the panels, until she found what she was seeking, a section of tongue-and-groove boarding that seemed slightly different from the rest. "Dolly, might I trouble you to hold this lamp closer?" In the improved light, Miss Marple could see that one narrow panel, perhaps 8 in wide, was not fixed in place like the others. When she pressed against its left edge, it slid smoothly to the right, revealing a gap just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Mrs. Bantry gasped. "I had no idea that was there. Grandmother never mentioned any hidden passages." Miss Marple peered through the opening, her lamp illuminating a narrow space beyond. "I believe this may be what they call a maid's pass, a service door that allowed servants to tend fires and perform other duties without disturbing guests. Quite common in houses of this period, though most have been sealed up over the years." She squeezed through the opening, finding herself in a cramped but navigable passage that ran behind the blue room's wall. At the far end, another door stood, slightly ajar, and through it she could see the familiar furnishings of the guest chamber. "This opens directly into the blue room," she called back to Mrs. Bantry. "Behind the wardrobe, if I'm not mistaken." Returning through the passage, Miss Marple emerged from the linen press with her suspicions confirmed. Someone had used this forgotten entrance to gain access to the blue room after it had been locked and bolted from the inside. But who would know about such a passage? Mrs. Bantry asked, clearly struggling with the implications. Someone intimately familiar with Gossington's history and construction. Someone who has been in the house long enough to discover its secrets. Miss Marple examined the key that Mrs. Bantry still held. "This key operates both the linen press and the passage door?" "I assume so. I've only ever used it for the press itself." Miss Marple took the key and examined it closely in the lamplight. The bit showed clear signs of recent use. Fresh grease along the edges and tiny particles of what appeared to be brick. Dust clinging to the metal. "Someone has used this key very recently," she observed, "and the passage shows signs of recent transit. Disturbed dust on the floor, and there are scrape marks on the sill of the door into the blue room." Mrs. Bantry sank onto a nearby chair, her face pale. You're saying someone in my own household used this passage to murder Mr. Mand? I'm afraid the evidence strongly suggests it, Miss Marple replied gently. The question now is who had access to this key and who possessed sufficient knowledge of the house to know about the passage. They made their way back to the main part of the house where Inspector Slack was waiting in the morning room with barely concealed impatience. His expression suggested that he considered the morning's investigations a waste of valuable time. Well, he demanded, found any more mysterious contraptions? Let Miss Marple describe their discoveries with characteristic precision. The sliding panel in the linen press, the narrow passage, and the door that opened directly into the blue room behind, the wardrobe. Inspector Slack listened with growing skepticism. Hidden passages? Really, Miss Marple, this isn't a Gothic novel. Even if such a passage exists, it doesn't change the fundamental facts. The man took an overdose of his medicine, accidentally or otherwise. But, Inspector, Mrs. Bantry interjected, if someone could enter and leave the room without using the main door, then they would still need to poison the fellow somehow, Slack replied dismissively. And there's no evidence of that. The bottle was prescribed by a reputable physician. The seal wasn't tampered with, and there were no signs of violence. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. You're quite right about the bottle, Inspector, which raises an interesting question about timing. If the medicine was delivered at 9:15 and Mr. Mand was found with it at his side, when did he actually take the fatal dose? When he felt poorly, obviously. Heart patients often take too much of their medicine when they panic. Yet Mrs. Beddoes mentioned that the salve ladle had an unusual odor, not the sharp, clean scent one would expect, but something bitter and green. Inspector Slack waved this away impatiently. Different chemists mixed things differently. Perfectly normal. But Miss Marple was remembering other details. The green smear on the saucer, the precise timing of the telephone call, and most importantly, the fresh grease on the linen press key. Someone had been very busy in the blue room the previous evening, and their activities extended far beyond the simple ringing of a bell. Inspector, she said quietly, might I suggest we speak with Mrs. Beddoes about the household keys? I believe we may find that the key to the linen press has been missing from her ring more recently than she realizes. The net was beginning to close, though its target remained frustratingly elusive. Someone in the house possessed both the knowledge and the opportunity to commit murder, but identifying them would require careful examination of the smallest details. The kind of domestic minutiae that Miss Marple had spent a lifetime observing and understanding. Chapter 7. Midnight in the Servants. Hall The servants' hall at Gossington possessed that peculiar quality of institutional rooms everywhere. Functional furniture arranged with mathematical precision, whitewashed walls that had witnessed countless conversations, and an atmosphere heavy with the accumulated wisdom of domestic service. Miss Marple had prevailed upon Inspector Slack to allow her and Sergeant Lake to maintain a quiet vigil there, ostensibly to ensure that no evidence was disturbed during the night. Sergeant Lake, a competent young man with the earnest demeanor of someone determined to prove himself worthy of his position, sat opposite her at the long oak table. Between them lay the service log that James maintained so meticulously, its pages chronicling the evening's events in careful handwriting. I still don't quite understand what we're hoping to accomplish, Lake admitted in a low voice. Inspector Slack seems convinced the case is straightforward enough. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked steadily in the lamplight. Oh, my dear. Sergeant, I'm quite sure Inspector Slack is correct about the fundamental facts. Mr. Mand is certainly dead, and the cause appears to be Digitalis poisoning. What troubles me are the smaller details. The things that don't quite fit the pattern. The eye. Old house settled around them with the familiar creaks and sighs of aged timber. Somewhere above, a floorboard groaned under an unseen weight, and the wind rattled the casement windows with increasing persistence. Miss Marple's eyes remained alert despite the late hour, her attention divided between her needlework and the various sounds that punctuated the night's stillness. At 10 minutes before midnight, they heard the distinct sound of the side door opening, the servants' entrance that connected the kitchen corridor to the stable yard. Footsteps, carefully muted, but still audible to trained ears, made their way along the flagstone passage. Sergeant Lake rose silently, moving with the practiced stealth of his profession toward the corridor entrance. Miss Marple continued her, knitting, though her needles moved with less regularity than before. The footsteps paused, then resumed with greater caution. A shadow appeared in the doorway, resolving into the figure of Lionel Swin. He moved with the concentrated attention of someone attempting to avoid detection, his expensive shoes making only the slightest whisper against the stone floor. "Looking for something, sir?" Sergeant Lake inquired pleasantly, stepping into view. Swin started violently, his hand flying to his chest. "Good Lord, you gave me a fright. I didn't realize anyone was still about at this hour." "Couldn't sleep, I expect?" Miss Marple observed sympathetically. "Such a disturbing day for everyone. But whatever brings you downstairs at this hour, Mr. Swin?" Swin's composure recovered quickly, though traces of his initial alarm remained visible. "I left a glove somewhere during the evening's confusion. I thought I might retrieve it without troubling anyone." He produced a leather glove from his coat pocket, displaying it with the air of someone offering proof of innocence. Yet Miss Marple noticed that the glove bore no signs of having been mislaid. No dust, no wrinkles, no indication of having spent hours forgotten in some corner. "Most thoughtful of you not to disturb the household," Sergeant Lake commented. "Though I'm curious how you knew to look in the servants' quarters. I thought I might have dropped it when I was admiring that portrait in the front hall with Mrs. Bantry." The corridor seemed the logical place to search. Miss Marple's needles had stopped clicking entirely. "Mr. Swin, forgive me, but might I ask what else you have in your pockets? You seem rather laden this evening." Swin's face flushed, but before he could respond, Sergeant Lake moved with surprising swiftness to examine the contents of his coat. From the inner pocket, he extracted a folded piece of paper bearing the Gossington letterhead, along with what appeared to be half of a torn wax wafer. "Now, what might this be?" Lake inquired, unfolding the document. The paper contained only a few lines of text written in Basil Mann's distinctive handwriting. "The matter we discussed requires immediate attention. I trust you understand the consequences of delay. The evidence speaks for itself, and I'm prepared to make it public unless we reach a satisfactory arrangement." Swin's attempt at nonchalance crumbled entirely. "It's not what you think. Mand was trying to extort money from me, threatening to expose certain irregularities in my business dealings." "What sort of irregularities?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Provenance. Issues. A miniature I'd hoped to sell turned out to have questionable documentation. Mand discovered this and demanded payment for his silence." Swin's voice grew bitter. "The man was nothing more than a blackmailer disguised as a scholar." Sergeant Lake examined the torn wafer with interest. "And this is part of a seal from a letter. Mand claimed it proved the miniature's false provenance. He was going to use it as evidence against me." From Swin's coat, the sergeant also produced a railway timetable with certain trains circled in pencil, and more surprisingly, a detailed sketch of what appeared to be the interior layout of a building. "This timetable shows an earlier departure than the one you mentioned to Mrs. Bantry. I changed my mind about leaving. The business with Mead needed to be resolved. Miss Marple studied the sketch with particular interest. How curious. This appears to be a floor plan of sorts, rather detailed for casual observation. Swin grew increasingly agitated. I have an interest in architectural features. Old houses fascinate me from a professional standpoint. Indeed. And this particular sketch seems to show a passage connecting two rooms, rather specific knowledge for someone who's only just visited Gossington. The questioning continued for another hour, revealing that Swin's financial situation was considerably more precarious than his elegant appearance suggested. Mead's threats had placed him in an impossible position, with potential ruin awaiting, if the forged documentation became public knowledge. But here's what puzzles me, Mr. Swin, Miss Marple said finally. You clearly had ample motive to wish Mr. Mead harm, and you've just demonstrated detailed knowledge of Gossington's layout that you shouldn't possess. Yet there's one crucial element missing from your story. What's that? Access. The blue room was locked and bolted from the inside. Even if you knew about the hidden passage, as your sketch suggests you did, you would need a key to the linen press, and that key has been in Mrs. Beddoes' exclusive possession for 15 years. Swin's face went white. You're suggesting I somehow obtained Mrs. Beddoes' key? I'm suggesting nothing, merely observing that the practical difficulties are considerable. Unless, of course, you had assistance from someone already in possession of the necessary access. The implications hung heavy in the air of the servants' hall. Swin clearly possessed motive and knowledge, but the physical mechanics of the crime seemed beyond his capabilities alone. Someone else had been involved. Someone with intimate knowledge of the house and unrestricted access to its secrets. I think, Miss Marple said quietly, we need to have a very serious conversation with Mrs. Beddoes about her keys. Chapter 8. Foxglove in a Bottle. The morning brought Dr. Haydock's return to Gossington Hall, his medical bag in hand, and his expression bearing the gravity of confirmed suspicions. He found Inspector Slack, Miss Marple, and the Bantrys assembled in the morning room, where the events of the previous night had left everyone in a state of heightened alertness. My examination confirms what I suspected yesterday evening, Dr. Haydock announced without preamble. Basil Mead died of digitalis poisoning, but not from any legitimate medical preparation. The concentration in his system was far too high for therapeutic use. Inspector Slack leaned forward with renewed interest. You're saying he was deliberately poisoned? I'm saying the digitalis that killed him was not the sal volatile he was prescribed. That bottle contained foxglove extract, cleverly disguised to resemble legitimate medicine. Someone took considerable care to make the substitution appear innocent. Mrs. Bantry pressed her handkerchief to her lips. But how could anyone manage such a substitution? The bottle was delivered directly from James to Mr. Mead's door. That, Dr. Haydock replied grimly, is what we need to determine. Miss Marple rose from her chair with purposeful intent. Doctor, might I suggest we examine the household's medical supplies? If someone prepared a substitute bottle, they would have needed access to digitalis extract as well as the means to transfer it convincingly. Their investigation led them first to the pantry, where Mrs. Beddoes maintained a small collection of household remedies and first aid supplies. Inspector Slack had already examined these cursorily, but Miss Marple's more thorough search soon yielded results. In the back corner of the Polish cupboard, behind bottles of brass cleaner and furniture wax, she discovered a tiny glass dropper no larger than her thumb. The instrument's tip bore unmistakable traces of a greenish residue that matched the mysterious stain on the blue room saucer. This hasn't been here long, she observed, examining the dropper in the morning light. The glass is clean except for this residue, suggesting recent use. Dr. Haydock took the dropper and sniffed carefully. Foxglove. Without question. Someone used this to transfer digitalis extract from its original container. But whose dropper is it? Mrs. Bantry asked. Surely someone in the household would recognize it. The answer came from Mrs. Beddoes herself, who appeared in the pantry doorway with obvious distress written across her features. It belongs to Miss Finch, the stationer. She lent it to someone yesterday for relabeling bottles for the charity drive. Lent it to whom? Inspector Slack demanded. Mrs. Beddoes hesitated, her loyalty to the household clearly warring with her duty to truth. She said she gave it to Mr. Swin, who claimed he needed it to re-ink a stamp on one of his documents. This information sent them immediately in search of Mabel Finch, who was found in the village shop, arranging displays of stationery with her customary precision. A spinster of middle years with the sharp efficiency common to successful shopkeepers, Miss Finch received their questions with obvious bewilderment. The little dropper? Yes, certainly. I lent it out yesterday, though I must say I'm puzzled about who actually borrowed it. What do you mean? Well, Mr. Swin approached me about it initially, but then Mrs. Beddoes came by later, saying she needed it for some household task. I gave it to her, assuming she was collecting it on Mr. Swin's behalf. The contradiction was immediately apparent. Swin claimed ignorance of the dropper, while Mrs. Beddoes insisted Miss Finch had given it directly to him. Someone was not telling the truth. They returned to Gossington and found Mrs. Beddoes in her sitting room, surrounded by the ledgers and account books that govern the household's domestic life. Miss Marple noted immediately that the housekeeper's recipe collection lay open on the desk, its pages filled with careful notations about preserves, remedies, and seasonal preparations. Mrs. Beddoes, Miss Marple began tactfully, might we discuss your herb collection? I understand you're quite knowledgeable about medicinal plants. The housekeeper's face flushed slightly. I've always taken an interest in traditional remedies. My grandmother taught me to recognize useful plants and prepare simple treatments, including foxglove. Foxglove can be beneficial for heart conditions when properly prepared, though it requires great care. I would never attempt to use it without proper medical supervision. Yet, as Miss Marple examined the recipe book more closely, she discovered a pressed foxglove flower marking a page devoted to cough syrups and respiratory treatments. The flower was recent enough to retain some of its original color, suggesting it had been placed there within the past few days. This is a beautiful specimen, Miss Marple observed. Where did you gather it? From the kitchen garden. We have several plants growing near the herb border. They're quite lovely, though I always warned the staff about their poisonous nature. Inspector. Slack's patience with botanical discussions was clearly wearing thin. Mrs. Beddoes, we need to know exactly what happened to Miss Finch's dropper. She says she gave it to you, but you claim it went to Mr. Swin. Mrs. Beddoes's composure began to crack under the sustained questioning. I may have been mistaken about the exact details. Yesterday was very confusing with so many people coming and going. The dropper was found in your pantry, Dr. Haydock pointed out, with clear evidence of foxglove residue. I can't explain that. Perhaps someone placed it there to implicate me. Miss Marple had been studying the housekeeper's herb collection with growing comprehension. The various bottles and containers were meticulously labeled and arranged, but one small vial caught her particular attention. It bore no label, but contained a dark liquid that seemed to correspond exactly with the residue found on the dropper. Mrs. Beddoes, she said quietly, this appears to be digitalis extract. Quite a concentrated preparation. The housekeeper's face went white. That's for my own heart condition. Dr. Morrison prescribed it months ago. Yet there's no prescription label, and the concentration appears far stronger than would be safe for self-medication. The net was closing around Mrs. Beddoes with inexorable precision. The evidence mounted steadily: her access to the linen press key, her knowledge of the house's hidden passages, her possession of the dropper used to transfer poison, and her collection of foxglove preparations. "I think," Miss Marple said with gentle firmness, "that we need to discuss what really happened in the Blue Room yesterday evening, because someone in this house prepared a substitute for Mr. Mann's medicine. Someone with detailed knowledge of both the household routines and the properties of digitalis." Mrs. Beddoes sank into her chair, her hands trembling as the weight of accumulated evidence became impossible to deny. The careful facade she had maintained throughout the investigation was finally beginning to crumble, revealing the desperate truth beneath. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I never meant for him to die. I only wanted to frighten him, to make him see reason." "Are you confessing to murder, Mrs. Beddoes?" Inspector Slack leaned forward sharply. The housekeeper's composure collapsed entirely. He was going to destroy Mrs. Bantry's reputation, drag her name through the newspapers for something that happened decades ago. "I couldn't let that happen. Not after everything she's done for me." The truth was finally beginning to emerge, though. Its full implications remained to be explored. Mrs. Beddoes had the means, the opportunity, and now apparently the motive for Basil Mann's murder. Yet Miss Marple sensed there were still details to be uncovered, secrets that went deeper than a simple case of misguided loyalty. Chapter 9. Wrong Provenance. The revelation of Mrs. Beddoes's partial confession had cast a pall over the morning room at Gossington Hall. Inspector Slack sat with his notebook open, methodically recording details, while Mrs. Bantry remained in stunned silence, clearly struggling to comprehend that her trusted housekeeper could be capable of murder. Miss Marple, however, continued to study the assembled evidence with the quiet intensity that marked her most productive moments of deduction. "Mrs. Beddoes," she said gently, "you mentioned that Mr. Mann threatened Mrs. Bantry's reputation over something that happened decades ago. Might I ask what sort of scandal he claimed to have discovered?" The housekeeper's hands twisted in her lap, her usual composure entirely abandoned. "It wasn't Mrs. Bantry's scandal at all. It was mine, from long before I came to Gossington, but Basil Mann said he would make it appear as though Mrs. Bantry had been involved, had concealed my past when she employed me." "What manner of past could justify such threats?" Dr. Haydock asked quietly. Mrs. Beddoes' voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "When I was very young, barely 20, I worked for a woman in Bethnal Green. She ran what she called a lying-in house for unmarried girls. I was innocent then, didn't understand what really went on there. By the time I realized it was little better than a baby farm, I was too frightened to leave." Miss Marple nodded with understanding. The scandal of baby farms, establishments that took in unwanted infants for fees and ensured they disappeared quietly, had rocked Victorian society. Any association with such places, however innocent, could destroy a reputation even decades later. "Mann found documentation of your employment. There, a receipt with my signature confirming payment for services rendered. He claimed he'd discovered it among some papers he was researching, though I suspect he'd been investigating my background deliberately." Mrs. Beddoes' voice grew bitter. "He said unless I helped him extract money from Mrs. Bantry, claiming she owed it for some imaginary family debt, he would publish the receipt along with implications about her knowledge of my past." Inspector Slack looked up from his notes. "So, you decided to poison him instead?" "No, I never intended to kill him. I thought if I could make him ill, really frighten him about his heart condition, he might see that blackmail was dangerous business and leave us alone. Miss Marple was reconstructing the timeline in her mind, fitting together the various pieces of evidence they had gathered. Let me see if I understand the sequence of events correctly. You knew about the hidden passage from your years managing the household. You used your key to enter the blue room through the linen press, substituted the doctored sal volatile for the genuine medicine, and arranged the bell mechanism to ring at 9:40 to establish a false time of death. The bell was an accident, Mrs. Beddoes protested. I was trying to leave through the passage when I knocked against the wardrobe. Something fell from my pocket, a hairpin, I think, and got caught in the mechanism. When I tried to free it, I only made it worse. But you realized the delayed ring would serve your purpose, so you left the mechanism in place. Mrs. Beddoes nodded miserably. I thought it would show that Mr. Mand was alive after I'd returned downstairs. I wrote the time in the service log, myself to make it official. And the telephone call at 9:05? That was Mand calling me to the anteroom phone. He wanted to gloat about his discovery, to make sure I understood exactly what he intended to do. He was already feeling unwell from the doctored medicine by then, but he was so pleased with himself that he didn't realize what was happening. Dr. Haydock frowned. You said you only intended to frighten him, but the concentration of digitalis in that bottle was lethal. There's no way such a dose could be considered merely a warning. Mrs. Beddoes' face crumpled. I know that now, but I was so desperate, so frightened of what would happen to Mrs. Bantry if the truth came out. I hoped, that just a little foxglove extract mixed with the sal volatile would make him sick enough to reconsider his threats. I had no experience with such things. Where did you obtain the digitalis? Miss Marple asked. From my own foxglove plants in the kitchen garden. I'd prepared an extract months ago for my arthritis. My grandmother taught me the old remedies. I knew it was dangerous, but I thought if I only used a small amount. Inspector Slack was growing impatient with the medical details. The bottom line is that you killed the man. Whatever your intentions, you entered his room through that passage, switched the bottles, and left him to die. But I stayed nearby, Mrs. Beddoes protested. I was in the servants' hall when the bell rang, ready to go up and help him if the medicine made him too ill. I thought he would call for assistance, that I could summon Dr. Haydock in time. Miss Marple studied the housekeeper with penetrating intensity. Yet when the bell did ring at 9:40, you made no move to respond. James noted the call, but you didn't suggest checking on Mr. Mann's welfare. I was afraid. By then, I realized something had gone terribly wrong. He should have called for help much earlier if the medicine was merely making him unwell. The fact that the bell rang so late made me fear the worst. The confession was devastating in its implications. Mrs. Beddoes had committed murder through inexperience and desperation, fatally misjudging the dosage required for her intended warning. Yet, there remained one element that troubled Miss Marple's orderly mind. Mrs. Beddoes, you mentioned that Mand claimed to have discovered the receipt during his research, but surely such a document would be quite valuable to a blackmailer. Why would he leave it among his papers where others might find it? I don't, and no. Perhaps he felt safe enough at Gossington. Or perhaps... She paused, looking confused. Perhaps he never actually had the original document at all. What do you mean? When he described it to me over the telephone, he seemed to know exactly what it looked like, what it said. But when I asked to see it, he said it was safely stored elsewhere. I never actually saw the receipt myself. Miss Marple exchanged glances with Inspector Slack. Are you suggesting that Mand was bluffing about having evidence against you? I don't know. He was so convincing, so detailed in his threats. But now that I think about it, he never produced actual proof. The possibility that Mrs. Beddoes had committed murder to prevent exposure of a scandal that existed only in Basil Mann's imagination was almost too cruel to contemplate. Yet it fitted with what they knew of Mann's character, his love of dramatic revelation, his enjoyment of others' discomfort. We'll need to search his belongings thoroughly, Inspector Slack decided. If this receipt exists, we'll find it. If not, he left the implications unspoken. Mrs. Beddoes had committed murder based on threats that might have been nothing more than elaborate bluffs designed to extract money from the Bantry household. The tragedy was complete. A life lost, another ruined. All for a secret that perhaps needed no protecting at all. Chapter 10. The Blue Room. Secret. The morning room at Gossington Hall had never witnessed such a solemn gathering. Mrs. Bantry sat beside her husband, her face pale but resolute as she faced the painful truth about her trusted housekeeper. The assembled company included all the principal players in the tragedy. Mrs. Beddoes, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, Lionel Swyn, his earlier arrogance replaced by subdued anxiety, Mr. Simmons with his legal papers, Inspector Slack, Dr. Haydock, the Reverend and Mrs. Clement, Mabel Finch, and Miss Marple, who had requested this final gathering to ensure that justice was both served and understood. Before Inspector Slack proceeds with the necessary legal formalities, Miss Marple began, I believe it would be helpful to review exactly what occurred in the Blue Room yesterday evening so that we may all understand how a tragic misunderstanding led to such devastating consequences. She moved to the center of the room, her gentle manner belying the precision with which she marshaled the evidence they had gathered. The method of entry was, as we discovered, through the old maid's pass connecting the linen press to the Blue Room. Mrs. Beddoes possessed the only key to this passage, having maintained the household keys for 15 years. The fresh grease on the keys bit and the brick dust particles clinging to it provided clear evidence of recent use. Additionally, the scrape marks on the passage door sill confirmed that someone had indeed used this forgotten entrance. Inspector Slack nodded approvingly. Straightforward enough once we found the passage. The timing mechanism was more ingenious, though as Mrs. Beddoes has explained, it was partially accidental. The hairpin and tin sliver wedged behind the wardrobe created a delayed trigger for the bell system. When the wardrobe shifted slightly, whether from footsteps, air currents, or settling of the old house, the bell would ring in the servants' hall, creating the false impression that Mr. Mann was alive at 9:40. Mrs. Beddoes spoke in barely a whisper. I only meant to leave quietly through the passage. When my hairpin caught in the mechanism, I tried to free it, but only made it worse. Then I realized the delayed ring might help establish that he was still alive after I'd returned downstairs. The poison itself was foxglove extract prepared from plants in Gossington's own kitchen garden and administered through the sal volatile bottle. The green residue on both the saucer and Miss Finch's borrowed dropper confirmed the method of transfer. Dr. Haydock interjected gravely. The concentration was far too high for any therapeutic purpose. Whether intended or not, it was a lethal dose. Miss Marple's expression grew infinitely sad. And there lies the greatest tragedy of this entire affair. Mrs. Beddoes acted out of desperate loyalty to protect her employer from a scandal that in all likelihood never truly existed. She gestured toward a small collection of papers on the side table. Mr. Simmons and I have examined every document in Mr. Mann's possession. We found no receipt from any Bethnal Green lying in establishment, no evidence whatsoever of the compromising document he claimed to possess. The room fell into stunned silence. Mrs. Bantry's hand flew to her throat. You mean he was lying about having evidence against Mrs. Beddoes? I believe Mr. Mand was an opportunist who preyed upon people's fears and vulnerabilities. He had clearly researched Mrs. Beddoes' background sufficiently to know about her youthful employment, but rather than possessing actual evidence, he relied upon her terror of exposure to make his threats seem credible. Lionel Swin stirred uncomfortably. Then, what he told me about his discoveries was also false? Not entirely. Your forged provenance for that miniature was quite real, as evidenced by the letter fragment and wax wafer you attempted to retrieve last night. But I suspect Mand's true discovery was not some earth-shaking family secret, but rather the household's vulnerabilities, your financial desperation, Mrs. Beddoes' shameful past, and Mrs. Bantry's generous nature. Miss Marple's voice grew gentle but firm. He made that telephone call at 9:05 to summon Mrs. Beddoes to the anteroom extension, where he could gloat privately about his leverage over the household. By then, the doctored sal volatile was already taking effect, though he was too pleased with his own cleverness to recognize the symptoms. Mrs. Beddoes was weeping quietly now. If I had only been braver, had demanded to see this receipt he claimed to have. My dear woman, Miss Marple replied with infinite compassion, when we are desperate to protect those we love, we do not always think clearly. Mr. Mand understood this, and exploited it ruthlessly. Inspector Slack cleared his throat. The facts remain that Mrs. Beddoes administered a fatal dose of digitalis with intent to cause harm, regardless of her motives or the victim's character. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. Though I believe any judge would consider the circumstances, the decades of faithful service, the desperate attempt to protect her employer's reputation, and the tragic miscalculation of the dosage required for her intended warning. Mr. Simmons spoke for the first time since the gathering began. I shall naturally provide the best legal representation possible. The evidence of provocation and the accidental nature of the fatal dose may well result in a reduced charge. Mrs. Bantry rose from her chair and moved to stand beside her housekeeper. Mrs. Beddoes has served this family with absolute loyalty for 15 years. Whatever mistakes she may have made, they came from devotion, not malice. As for Mr. Swin, Miss Marple continued, his forgeries constitute a separate matter that will, no doubt, be dealt with by the appropriate authorities in London. However, his knowledge of the house's layout, while suspicious, appears to have been gained through legitimate architectural interest rather than criminal intent. Swin nodded gratefully. I swear I had no knowledge of any planned violence. My only crime was attempting to conceal my business difficulties. Inspector Slack rose and approached Mrs. Beddoes with the grim formality his duty required. Mrs. Elizabeth Beddoes, I am arresting you for the murder of Basil Mand. You're not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say will be taken down and may be used in evidence. Mrs. Beddoes accepted the inevitable with quiet dignity. I understand, Inspector. I only hope that someday Mrs. Bantry can forgive me for the shame I've brought upon her household. As the official proceedings concluded and the various participants began to disperse, Mrs. Bantry accompanied Miss Marple toward the front hall. At the foot of the grand staircase, they paused before ascending to the upper floors. Jane, Mrs. Bantry said quietly, squeezing her friend's hand. Thank you for uncovering the truth. At least now we understand what really happened in that terrible room. Miss Marple looked up toward the blue room corridor, where sunlight now streamed peacefully through the tall windows. So that was the blue room secret after all. What do you mean? Miss Marple smiled with gentle wisdom. Not ghosts, my dear, but habits. Old houses keep their secrets as faithfully as good servants do. And sometimes those habits, however well-intentioned, can lead us into the darkest of tragedies. The mystery of the Blue Room was solved, but its cost would linger long in the memory of all who had witnessed the destructive power of fear, loyalty, and misplaced trust.